Hi, I'm Nick Thomas, instructor at the Academy of Historical Fencing, and here today to talk to you about the Spadroon. Now, as the title of this video suggests, we're trying to establish whether this is the master of all weapons or the perfect encumbrance. Now, those are both quotes that were documented to do with this kind of sword. The first, master of all weapons, from Sir William Hope, who was a well-celebrated fencing master, and the second from a British Army artillery officer in the Napoleonic Wars, so approximately 100 years apart. One thought they were absolutely fantastic, the other thought they were terrible and left it at home and carried a dirk, basically a small dagger instead. So that's the kind of situation we're at, is were they a wonderful sword or were they a terrible sword? Now, Spadroons have got, certainly in the last few years, to the point of being even meme-worthy in the online community, and there's a lot of stuff going around about Spadroons on the online community, and you'll find all kinds of information to do with Spadroons, whether it's people saying how wonderful they are or how terrible they are, joking about them in good and bad ways, and we're really trying to establish what they are and actually how good they are. Because there's all kinds of information, both good and bad, out there about the Spadroon. So we're going to try and establish exactly what it is, how good it was, and how it relates to history and how it relates to the practice of swordsmanship today as well. So a little bit about myself and about why I'm making this video and what my sort of expertise is and my field of interest, and also any potential bias, because I'll talk about that as well. So I am one of the lead instructors at the Academy of Historical Fencing, and one of the principal things that we practice at the club is military swordsmanship from the Napoleonic period, and specifically infantry swordsmanship, because we don't have horses. And that's really what our interest is the sword on foot. Now, the Spadroon is a huge part of that, because it's possibly the most significant infantry regulation sword of the time period. So it's one of many, there were others used, but it's one of the most significant, possibly the most significant. So I already pursue it as a field of research and interest. Now, for me, that means I work from original source manuals on learning how to use the sword and teaching others how to use it, because we've got two fencing clubs. And so yeah, we do teach this weapon and the related weapons for it. But also, I am a collector of originals, so I have 10 antique Spadroons of my own, and I often handle others, look at others at museums, auction houses, military affairs, other collectors. So I handle a lot of them. I research their use. I research anything I can possibly find about them in old books. I'm talking, 17th, 18th, 19th century books, newspapers, absolutely anything I can get referencing these swords in their time period, to understand the context of the whole weapon, its use, what people thought of it in the time, how and where it was used, all these kinds of things. So yeah, I am a researcher, martial artist, and a collector, so I look at it from all three of those perspectives. Now, any potential bias, because I'll add this. I started a group on Facebook called Spadrooners, and it's dedicated to the Spadroon. And it is exactly as it sounds. It's discussion of the Spadroon, research, practice, that kind of thing. And it's open to anybody to come and get involved with if you've got an actual interest in Spadroons. So you can come and get involved in the discussion and see pictures, images, data, videos, all kinds of things like that shared on the Spadroon as an antique and its practice today by modern practitioners. So therefore you might think I have a bit of a bias. It wouldn't actually be entirely fair. I've actually been pretty damn hard on Spadroons in the past, and basically years and years of research and seeing more original examples and just getting more data and more of a feel for it has led me to slightly different conclusions than I have in the past. So I've made videos about Spadroons in the past, shorter videos rather than this kind of thing, and there's plenty of good information in there, but certainly I've been basing some of it on too few examples. So I've got a lot more data to go on now, a lot more research, and I'm going to cover it in a lot more detail in this much longer video. One thing that is really worth mentioning about the Spadroon in terms of the way it's viewed today and the way people talk about it today is they're often talking about a few bad examples and that's really significant to understanding the Spadroon and what it could possibly be like. And that would be a huge mistake. The Spadroon roughly had a service life of around 200 or just over 200 years. So you really wouldn't want to judge how good a sword is based on one example in one particular time period, because it would give you quite a skewed idea of what the weapon was like. You wouldn't take, say, a rapier or a saber from 100, 200 years apart and necessarily think one represents the other. It might do, but they can often be a world apart. And you look at, say, a military saber from the 17th century ranging up to, say, the early to mid-19th century, and you're going to see significant changes. So the Spadroon, there's a lot more to it. You can't simply just say they're this, they're that. It's actually a whole family of swords. So you're talking, yeah, over 200 years of use, and we're going to be covering in this video all of that time and looking at how good or bad they were, and the different varieties as we go through. So one of the things we need to establish is what actually is a Spadroon, because a lot of people don't know and there's a lot of confusion over it, and it can mean different things to some degree in different time periods and cultures, and different things to different people. So let's establish or look at how the term Spadroon was used in its day. Now, the first occasion we can see of the term Spadroon being used is by Donald McBain in his manual in 1728. But he also makes it clear that the shearing sword and the Spadroon are the same thing. Okay, and that allows us to look back a little bit further to the manuals of Sir William Hope, who he released several manuals in the late 17th and early 18th century, and discusses the shearing sword and how good it is, and specifically what it actually is. And he breaks down the different sword types, or specifically blade types, because it's not about the hilt as such. The hilt can be sometimes mentioned, but significantly to Hope, the difference between these different weapons is the blade type, in terms of what they look like and how they act. So, the way he talks about the shearing sword is that it is lighter than the Scottish broadsword and able to cut and thrust. So it is a mixed cut and thrust sword, and that is a term that you're going to see coming up all the way through the Spadroon era. The Spadroon was often called the cut and thrust sword because it is well suited to both. It's a mixed weapon, as opposed to the Scottish broadsword, which mainly it can thrust, but it favours the edge. It's a strong cutting sword. And when we talk about Scottish broadsword, we're talking about something like this. Now, this is the only reproduction you're going to see in this video. All of the other swords are antique and original, but I don't currently own a Scottish basket-hilted broadsword, but this is a high-quality reproduction and gives you some idea. So, the Spadroon can technically have very much the same shaped blade as a broadsword, but will just be a bit smaller, a bit lighter, a bit more agile. So it is very much the Spadroon, or the shearing sword of that time, was a light broadsword, if you like, and potentially later on a light backsword. So if you took this blade from this broadsword and reduced it down a little bit, let's forget about the hilts because it's not necessarily relevant to the type of blade. Spadroon, broadsword, small sword there, although the hilts can often be significant and common to the particular blade type, defining the weapons is mainly by the blade, primarily. So this is a broadsword blade, nice and broad, gonna favour the cut. And if you then reduce that down and make it a bit thinner, so for the shearing sword of Hope, the Spadroon, or cut and thrust sword, was double-edged. And McBain says that as well. And that's interesting because later on the Spadroon was much more commonly a single-edged or backsword blade. So things do change over time. But yeah, as far as McBain and Hope were concerned, the shearing sword, or Spadroon, was a light broadsword. Now, if you go too light, what you're going to end up with is a small sword. Now, a small sword is the evolution of the rapier, is very light and realistically just for thrust work. So it's so light, really, really light. Small swords are often 400 up to 500 grams, something like that. They're a very light sword, designed really only for thrust work. There are some that have very limited cutting abilities, but realistically they are a thrust-in sword, primarily for civilian wear, but they saw use in the military as well, particularly as officers' sidearms. So there you go, that's how the blades break down. So we're talking entirely straight blades. They have to be straight to be in these specific categories. Broadsword is the broad blade that favours more cutting. Small sword is the narrow double-edged blade, but it can be triangular as well. The narrow blade that is for thrusting only, and therefore the shearing or spadroon is in between. It is a 50-50 cut and thrust, can do both. It's agile compared to the broadsword, but it's able to cut where the small sword cannot. And that is as simple as the definition comes. So you can find a variety of different hilt types, and the blades can look a little bit different. And sometimes the boundaries between which is small sword, spadroon or shearing, and broadsword can be really difficult to define. And it might come down to the individual and your personal preference, your physical size. There are all kinds of factors. So there are swords that we can say are definitely one or one of those three, and there are a lot that are in grey areas in between, and that might come down to specifically, as I said, how you choose to use your sword as opposed to what it necessarily would look like in a photo. But there you go. Shearing sword at that point in the late 17th and the early 18th century, shearing sword or spadroon was a light broadsword that likes to use a lot of thrust work. So to MacBain and to Hope, who were clearly experienced and well-respected swordsmen of their day, the shearing sword or the spadroon was an excellent sword. They both talk about its ability to be used in a range of scenarios. It is faster than a broadsword, it's more agile, but it can still cut, and essentially it just does everything well. So it's just a good all-rounder. So that's what they thought of it. And if you look at the origins, you can trace the origins of what they're calling a shearing sword or a spadroon back to the early 17th century, and you see this emergence of swords that often do have one or two, often two shells, and they are relatively agile and unrestricted in the hilt, so they're simple and easy to manufacture, a good amount of protection without too much that it restricts movement, and they're fast and they're roughly medium length, and you can see those coming in really heavily in the 17th century, and really the early 17th century. And that's really the origin of the spadroon, and specifically the Walloon sword, as we would call it today, which is a modern term which is common on the continent, and the mortuary sword in Britain. The mortuary sword is essentially a simple basket hilt that has less protection than some of the big baskets you think of as Scottish swords or some of the Elizabethan basket hilts. It's reduced down and simplified in terms of manufacture, but it still has protective sections on the guard that go from the shells to the side of the pommel. And that's significant actually when you want to do thrust work, because the way we want to use a sword to thrust is if you've got bars that connect to the pommel on the side, not just the front, you can't use this kind of position for thrusting, which is really well suited to using thrust with a sword like this. So that's the turning point, is when you start to remove those sidebars. And you can look at around about the English Civil War and just the decades after, going into the late 17th century, when a range of what we would call munitions swords, so simple soldiers' swords, start to look very much like this. They have their double shells and this knuckle bow, what was called a ward iron back then. They're roughly this length, about 32 inch. They're about this weight, so they're agile. And you can just see them becoming really, really common, actually across the whole of Europe. So it's just a simple sword that has shells, knuckle bow, and a fairly agile blade of medium length. So it's just becoming really, really common. And in Hope and MacBain, they talk about it being common on the continent. Now, Hope also mentions that some shearing swords, or spadroons if you like, had a back wand. Now, the back of the hand is this. A back wand, what he almost certainly is referring to, is a bar that goes from the side of the shells down to the pommel. So it's a protective section for the back of the hand. And that is seen on the mortuary sword, because the mortuary sword essentially has that both sides. Mortuary swords are usually symmetrical, so they have this wand on both sides from the shells down to the pommel. Whereas Hope says that the shearing sword, that some have this back wand, but are clearly not all of them. And as I said, that is significant in terms of how you do thrusting techniques, because having that does restrict movement. But there were ways developed to get around that by bringing the wand into the knuckle bow and circling it in to the front of the pommel and things like that. So they got around it eventually as well. So yeah, that back wand is really commonly seen on Walloon swords and a lot of munitions grade infantry swords in Britain in the 17th century as well. So that is almost certainly what Hope was talking about with the shearing sword. So they were actually already in common usage by Hope's period in the late 17th century across the whole of Europe, including Britain. So it would be a common infantryman's sword. Now, we've got through Hope and McBain, who clearly loved the Spadroon. They thought it was just great. It did everything well. But then that takes us from the Master of all weapons, absolutely loved, to the perfect Encumbrance. Now, there were other names for the Spadroon which weren't all that nice. It was called the Regulation Spit, or the Toasting Fork as well. So there were some really, really bad nicknames for this sword, quite derogatory, and they were clearly hated. So how do we get from the Master of all swords to the perfect Encumbrance? Now I'm going to go into a little bit about the different patterns of sword, or regulations of sword, a little later on in more detail. But right now I'm going to just jump in and look at why do people have a problem with the Spadroon, and is it justified? I'm just going to talk about that flat out, because we have to get to why it's disliked by a number of people. Okay, British regulations for Spadroons. So the first introductory regulation for a sword like this came in 1786. So clearly back in McBain and Hope's day, there was not a simple standardised regulation sword. It could be a variety of different things. So it's even hard to say exactly what the specification would be, because it's not written down on paper. It's not a plan or a pattern, if you like, a sealed pattern. So it's a little looser in definition. But when we get into the late 18th century, then going into the early 19th, when these are still in use, this is when you see the 1796 come in. And as I said, I'll talk about this pattern a little bit later, but let me just look at the complaints that people have with the Spadroon. So, the first one is it's too flexible. Now, as a sword that wants to do a lot of thrust work, you don't want an overly flexible sword, because particularly with decent wool clothing, it'll just not penetrate the clothing and not be particularly good at thrust work. Small swords are typically quite stiff, and that's ideal for a thrusting sword. So, are they too flexible? The answer is, and you're going to see this quite a lot, sometimes, but not always. So this is a rubbish example of the 1796, and it is really, really, really flexible. I would not want to try and actually use this as a fighting weapon. So, if you judge the 1796 or any Spadroon by this particular example, yes, you would think it is rubbish. It is very narrow at the tip, so it doesn't have much cutting ability. It has too much flex in the blade, not good on the thrust. It's very narrow at the shoulder. That's the thickness of the blade this way, the depth of the blade, if you like. It's very narrow, this one. And overall, it's just a rubbish sword. Really rubbish. So, yes, this is an example of a rubbish Spadroon. I would hate to have to use this. There are worse swords out there, but it's not good. So, worse Spadroons, not stiff enough. No, is the simple answer. You have to look at different examples and individual examples to be able to judge that. So this, for example, is now quite rigid. This is as rigid as a lot of infantry sabres in the 19th century, which were well regarded. And as another example, this is a sergeant's version of the 1796 that is, you can see it's around here, it's completely rigid. It's still very, very rigid, again, more like a sabre of the 19th century. So, were they not stiff enough? No, that's not fair to say. There were a lot of examples like that terrible one that I showed you. There certainly were plenty of examples of late 18th and early 19th century Spadroons that weren't good on the thrust because of that too much flexibility. But by no means does that define the Spadroon. That is individual examples that were poor. So let's look at a few other things that people come up with the Spadroon. Well, it's too thin, it doesn't cut very well. So this goes back to its ability as a fighting weapon, the ability to do damage. We just established that it can do damage on the thrust. We have recorded accounts of people being run through with the Spadroon, which clearly shows that there were examples that was plenty stiff enough to use for thrust work. I've shown you some there, and we know that they compare favourably to a range of 19th century swords that were successful as well. So, we've already got the thrust sorted out. What about the cut? Well, again, if I go back to the bad example of the Spadroon that I showed you, it is very thin up here. Now, if that's well sharpened and you cut well, it will cut perfectly well, and this one has been service sharpened. So, it's not great. It is very, very light. And if you look at, say, this example, so some Spadroons have very narrow blades, and although this is an infantry regulation, this is marked up with the George cipher on it, this is a British infantry officer's sword of the 1786 regulation, but the blade, it looks like a small sword. And to be honest, you might actually classify this as a small sword, because remember, the blade is more significant to the definition in most cases than the hilt is. So even though this is an army regulation sword, the blade you could rightfully call a small sword more than a spadroon, potentially. Again, going back to how you define it and a few other factors. But it's a double-edged blade, diamond section, and it's very, very narrow, and it has very limited cutting abilities. So there are some spadroons that are like that. And yet, I go back to some of the heavier examples. This one is much broader at the tip, and significantly, it's very, very broad, 8.5 millimeters at the shoulder here, with relatively little distal taper. So that's the taper of the depth of the blade, thickness here down to thin down here, and there's not that much distal taper, and it's quite broad at the tip. So it's actually got a fair bit of mass. Now this one it moves and hits like a saber, a typical 19th century infantry saber. So once again, could spadroons cut well or not? It comes down to the individual example. So Hope McBain thought they cut brilliantly well, clearly. So the early shearing swords and spadroons were well regarded. And you go to the late 18th and into the early 19th century, and you're going to have to look at individual examples, which is why you can't judge an entire category or entire family of swords based on one particular example. So the simple answer is some can cut fine, perfectly well, and cut well, and others cannot. So there are bad examples, there are good examples. The next thing will be the hand protection. As another thing that comes up with modern practitioners today is they've got terrible hand protection, it's really poor. But you've got to look at it in context. So often people are comparing them to sort of big ball-hilted sabres of the mid to late 19th century. But this isn't a sword from the mid to late 19th century, so it's not fair to compare it to it. You've got to compare it to the contemporaries of its day. So this is another sergeant's example, and curiously, it's very, very light compared to the other sergeant's example I showed you. Even though it looks broad, it's actually got a lot of distal taper, so it's a lot lighter than it looks. So this one's actually under 600 grams. It's the lightest spadroon of this type I've ever seen with the fuller blade. So, does it have poor hand protection? Well, actually, no. It's got larger shells than a small sword would have, a thicker knuckle bow than a small sword, so it already has more protection than a small sword. Sabres of the late, most of the 18th century, or certainly the late 18th century, tended to just have a knuckle bow. A lot of them. There were some with more, but you look at things like the 1788 cavalry patterns, the 1796 cavalry pattern, they're just a simple knuckle bow. So the spadroon usually has shells or some kind of loop on the side. So already the spadroon has more protection than a small sword, more protection than most sabres that were in use. So the last thing to compare them to is a Scottish broadsword that was in use, so the basket hilt. Well, obviously it's got less hand protection than a Scottish broadsword, and you get the advantages and disadvantages that come with that. Basket hilt adds a lot of weight down at the hand and a lot of mass for wearing it as well. So compared to most swords of its time, the spadroon actually has as much hand protection or more, so it certainly isn't down on the hand protection stakes. The last thing I'd probably talk about is the grip. Now, a criticism of the spadroon is that they still use this symmetrical grip and pommel construction, which was typical for hundreds of years at this point. And at that time period, a new style was really coming into use in Britain that had actually existed for a while longer in other countries, but a type that was coming in that you'll see in cavalry swords all the time with a more ergonomic asymmetrical grip and a back strap. And that is generally considered to be a huge advancement in swords particularly designed for the cut, but to some degree to the thrust as well. And the symmetrical grip and pommel construction is considered inferior. It's certainly an older style. And in many ways, the 1796 Spadroon, for example, is a little bit old school for its day, when most other swords of the period were moving on to these ergonomic asymmetrical grips with back straps. The Spadroon had held on to the old style of pommel and symmetrical grip. But that does not tell the full story, because actually on the initial regulations of Spadroon, the 1786, they didn't stipulate any kind of hilt form. The colour had to match the buttons of your uniform, but you could do whatever you wanted with it. So you could have double shells, you could have a knuckle bow, you could have a side ring, you could have a slotted hilt. There were all kinds of varieties, and you could do whatever you wanted with the grip and the backstrap. And hence here, this hilt form follows the 1788 light cavalry form that was in use. So it has the ergonomic asymmetrical grip and the backstrap. So if you want to level the criticism that Spadroons were a bit outdated in their grip construction, well, it's not entirely true at all, because plenty of them had the sabre style, what you think of as the sabre style grip of the late 18th and early 19th century. So I'd also add to that small swords didn't move to this. Small swords kept the symmetrical grip and pommel construction, and it was well suited to a thrust-in sword. And being as the Spadroon is a mixed cut and thrust sword, it's reasonable to think that you might want to combine features of the small sword and the broad or sabre, okay? So, those are just a quick, relatively quick, look at the criticisms that people level at the Spadroon, and are they justified? And the simple answer is, overall no, but on the individual examples they might be correct, because there are terrible examples, they're good examples. And I will add to that people these days, I say these days, it's a generalization, but a lot of people look at the Spadroon as some kind of unique weapon that is just really odd in its characteristics and its approach. It's not. It's actually really common. The principle of the Spadroon is a medium length, medium protection, agile sword that can cut and thrust. Now, that is something that went on for hundreds of years and was really successful and used really commonly. So there's actually nothing revolutionary or unusual about the Spadroon as such. It is just a light cut and thrust sword. It's nothing weird at all. And as a result, it can work really well, and it can work badly, like every other sword kind, really. If you look at any type of sword, there are ways to make it good, there are ways to make it bad, and there are ways to make it sort of middling and acceptable without being wonderful. And the Spadroon covers all of those categories. The next thing we're going to look at is the emergence of patterns or regulations for the Spadroon, because it is a huge turning point, and I have already mentioned it in the video, that in 1786, the first regulation was introduced that brought in a standard for these kinds of swords, as opposed to previously it was left down to the regiment or the individual to do what they wanted. And in 1786, they brought in a blade regulation that called for a 32-inch by 1-inch minimum blade. The 1 inch meant here, or at least that's what most people interpreted it as. They could have meant it was supposed to be 1 inch on the entire length, but certainly if you look at surviving examples, it was interpreted as 1 inch here, which isn't a particularly helpful regulation, really, because just because something's 1 inch down here, for example, my pretty much small sword bladed example is actually 1 inch exactly at the shoulder, and yet it's really narrow small sword blade at the tip. So it's actually not a very good way of wording it, because you could do whatever you wanted with that. Just because something has to be 32 by 1 inch minimum, it doesn't mean you can't start going with any kind of blade construction in terms of single or double-edged, full or nut. You could hollow grind it, you could make it as wide as you wanted, you could taper it in terms of profile or distal taper any way you wanted. So actually, under those regulations, apart from the fact that it has to be straight and of that medium length, you could do kind of whatever you wanted with it. So that regulation, you could end up with anything from a small sword through something like a cut and thrust typical Spadroon, all the way up to a Highland broadsword. So it's not a very useful blade regulation. Nonetheless, that's what they did. So in 1786, they brought in that regulation, and the sword hilt just had to match your uniform buttons, and you end up with all different forms of hilt. And that period in the 1780s is when the plain stirrup hilt was really coming into fashion. You see the light cavalry sabre taking that, and the famous 1796 following with something similar in the next decade. And Spadroons followed suit as well. Now, it probably wasn't the best idea in the world, because when you do a lot of thrust work, you want a bit more hand protection. Those shells, the reason that small swords have shells on the front is because you want shells when you're doing a lot of thrust work. So if you're doing a lot of thrust work, they're a good thing. So when you've got a Spadroon, and in this case more a small sword, that doesn't have them, that's a major disadvantage. At the same time, this style was really fashionable in the 1780s and 1790s, and it does have a huge plus point of it's much more comfortable to wear. And where does the sword spend most of its time? Well, either on your side or in some kind of storage. It doesn't actually spend much time in battle. So in terms of comfort, it's wonderful because you only have the protection on the outside, so it can sit flush against your uniform, so it doesn't rub anything, it's comfortable. So that's a good thing. But the one thing I will say about the 1786 is they tend, not always, but they tend to be quite good fighting weapons. They tend to have blades that are a bit more robust than the ones that followed it, and because the hilts are a little bit lighter, although you've got less protection, they have a bit more blade presence, because you put a fairly light blade on quite a heavy hilt, like the 1796 is, well, it brings all the balance all the way back into the hilt, and it doesn't make it particularly well suited to cut in, and to some degree can make parries a little bit weak as well. So these 1786s, they tend to be really nice fighting swords, and they can often feel a bit more like a sabre, in terms of this one does, in many ways, feel like a lot of 19th century sabres. And as I said, they could vary a lot. So this example, see, it has no side ring at all, it's just the simple D guard or stirrup, and it has a very, very broad blade. Whether you classified that as a spadroon or a broadsword, it would have to be down to the individual to say. I think it probably is still just about a spadroon, but it's certainly on the large side, and this feels quite cutty compared to a lot of other examples. So there's the 1786 regulation. It could vary a bit, and some of them did have double shells on, like the latest 1796. So now we move on to the famous or infamous 1796 pattern, which I've shown you throughout this video, and I keep showing you different examples. So this one you haven't seen yet. It's another one, another officer's example. So this is the third officer's example I've shown you, and the second, you've had two NCOs to go with that as well, two sergeant swords. Right, the 1796. This is the one where realistically all the hatred comes from to do with spadroons. And people then define the entire category of spadroons by this particular sword, which of course isn't very fair, but it's not even very fair when it's being judged on one or two examples of them as well, because the 1796 uses the same regulation for the blade as the previous 1786, 32 inches long by 1 inch minimum at the shoulder. Now, officers had to buy their own swords. Sergeants were supplied with swords, but officers had to procure their own swords. Now, that could mean different things. They could just go to a general store and buy a sword, because they did sell them, which you probably get something not particularly good. That's often called a tailor's sword in some sources. So you just basically bought it from a clothing shop, and you're probably not going to get a particularly good sword there. Or you could go and have something made by a good swordsmith, and you could then have it made however you wanted, of course. So an officer's sword could end up really however you want it. Now they were now confined to using this regulation of double shells and this overall hilt form, but it's not a bad hilt form. It's particularly if it has solid shells, because they can fold, and the folding shells are weak. If it has good strong solid shells and you apply a good blade to it, it's actually a good fighting sword. Now, I have no statistics on proportionally how many of these 1796s were good swords. I probably now handled 100 to 150 examples, which is enough to say a good amount about them, but it's not enough statistically to analyse it as to how many were good and how many were bad. But I will say that there are lots of bad examples, and there are still plenty of good ones. So this one is a good example. It's not super heavy. It's a kind of a medium weight, or maybe just above medium weight. So it's nice and strong, it's reasonably flexible, and reasonably stiff, as I should say. Not quite as stiff as the beastly one that I showed you, or the two beastly ones that I showed you. So this is a good middling ground, and it's like a lot of 19th century sabres in its overall mass and handling characteristics. It's a nice example without being too heavy or anything like that. So the 1796 regulation, as I say, some people might have preferred to have had some kind of back strap on it, because that's the way swords were moving. But ultimately, this grip shape and this hilt type was in use for, hundreds of years already, and it was perfectly successful. So they were managing perfectly well with it before it was a perfectly good hilt type. If you think a back strap was an ergonomic grip is better, maybe it was, but this was very, very successful. So I wouldn't complain about it too much. And so long as it's made robustly and you have a decent broad blade on it, so it's still a spadroon, but a nice broad, strong spadroon blade, it's actually quite a good sword. So, the 1796. People judge Spadroons overall based on the 1796, which isn't fair because there are so many other kinds of Spadroons. And there are really good examples of the 1796, and there are really terrible ones. So they can range, to give you an idea in weight, a 1796 Spadroon from the ones I have weighed can range from about 580 grams all the way up to even a kilo if some of the broader bladed ones, which you might then call a broadsword. But the ones you definitely call still a Spadroon can range from about 580 up to about 800 grams or more. And that's a massive variance for one type of sword. Since we've been talking about the 1786 and the 1796 regulation Spadroons, it's really worth at this point talking about the term Spadroon and its military usage, and also how it changed in its usage in terms of language. Because I did mention earlier that as far as Bane and Hope were concerned, the shearing sword or Spadroon was a double-edged blade. But as I've shown going to the late 18th century, the Spadroon was very often, I would say definitely more commonly, a single-edged blade. This is what we would call a backsword. It's a light backsword, but it is a backsword. And how did that happen? Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at Hope's shearing sword definition and the other definitions that he has of blades, because he basically puts swords into three categories. The ones that can only thrust, which are basically, he says, rapier and narrow-bladed three-edged blade, which is like the triangular-shaped small swords. And by rapier he means basically a double-edged small sword, like this. So the thrust-only blades. Then he has the swords that favour the cut, which as far as he's concerned back then is the Highland broadsword and the sabre. And finally, a third category of cut and thrust mixed swords, which he says are basically a wide-bladed small sword that has some cutting ability, the shearing sword, and the English backsword. So that category there is lumped together, so it's basically the lighter-bladed cut and thrust swords. Now that's an interesting point because we know that the Spadroon largely, by the end of the 18th century going into the 19th, they almost all were backswords. And the term backsword was kind of just vanishing from use. It still has some use sportively because backswording was very much a sport. But in terms of sharp swords, you see the term backsword just vanishing really quite quickly. So what happens to the backsword? Now this is an English backsword that I own. It's an antique from approximately 1620. So very typical of the early 17th century basket hilts, with its hollow, almost round pommel, and the quillons now gone, which were still on early basket hilts. They were mostly gone by the early 17th century. And what essentially happened? Well, the interesting thing is if you get a English backsword and compare it to a decent, sturdy example of the 1796 Spadroon, the blades can often be really similar, and I do mean really similar. Now, the significant difference is the fuller, but that's not going to make a massive difference to the blades. This essentially has a very narrow fuller running down its spine. In terms of cutting ability and handling characteristics, these are near identical. Now that's interesting because the English backsword was a highly regarded sword, and today it's a highly regarded sword because people love particularly things like George Silver and these basket-hilted swords, and they rant and rave about them, and rightly so. They are good swords, but it's a case of, it's quite interesting that you look at some original examples and they are, in terms of blade, very much the same type as a sturdy example of the 1796. And there you have sort of the answer of what happened. Is there was a trend to move the Spadroons onto a backsword style blade, and the backsword and the shearing sword of the early 18th century were in the same sort of category of weapon. They weren't quite the same, but they were in that's one of the three categories that Hope defined. So the backsword and the shearing sword or Spadroon were very closely related, and as a backsword blade style became more common with the Spadroon hilt, they basically merge into one. Because if you look at backswords of the 18th century, they have often got hilts identical to the Spadroons. Double shell, more open hilt. So suddenly the backsword and your shearing sword are just merging together. And that's why in many ways the Spadroon and a lot of backswords have a lot in common, and often they can be much the same sword. They can often look identical. Sometimes you could have a hard time deciding which one is which. So there you go. There's an English backsword, which is a fine fighting weapon. Incidentally, this one is just under a kilo, when you think the Spadroon I showed you is 750 grams. But the large part of that is this big basket hilt, so they're very much the same kind of weapon. As far as the term Spadroon is actually used in its actual context of its day, the interesting thing about it is it's realistically a civilian term. Is that if you look at any military sources, whether it's manuals on swordsmanship or any kind of documents in terms of diaries, accounts, written works, anything official, you just, as far as I've seen so far, and I've really dug deep, I've never found the term Spadroon being used by the military. Now that's not so surprising because they don't need to define what kind of sword it is. You know, if you are a line infantry officer, you'd expect it to be carry a Spadroon. If you're a grenadier officer, you'd carry a sabre. So you would just use a regulation term. It's a regulation sword. Regulation sword for cavalry, regulation sword for line infantry. So you wouldn't need to have a specific term to actually differentiate between those. Whereas, you know, in the civilian context, which civilians were learning military swordsmanship as essentially as a pastime or in readiness for military life, things like that. Now in that context, they haven't got a military unit that they're attached to, something like that. They haven't got the context of which sort of sword should they have. And also for us looking back over hundreds of years of sword history, we often need to define things a bit more clearly as well. So the Spadroon, you'll see the term coming up in various manuals on swordsmanship, for example, that were not official military manuals. But in British military uses, you just don't find the term Spadroon. You know, Spadroons were normally just called the regulation sword or the regulation infantry sword. You just didn't really need to use the term Spadroon. But the only time I have seen it being used is in an American manual, which was an officially recognised document by the army, and they do actually use the term Spadroon, so that's the only time I've seen it used. And the term Spadroon was really only used from the early 18th century until approximately the early 19th century anyway. There are a few usages after that, a few in novels, a few bits in America, for example. But it's relatively short-lived and shortly used, and the way it's applied today, we'd normally apply it to any sword that would have been called Spadroon or shearing sword in its day, and potentially to foreign, because they say it's an English word for the English language, but in terms of foreign swords, if they roughly fit the same sort of category of the 1786, 1796 type swords and the earlier Spadroons and shearing swords and things like that, then we might call them a shearing sword or a Spadroon as well. So that's the way the language changed. So yeah, there's an interesting thing about the word Spadroon, but overall it is just a light cut and thrust sword, and that's all that really matters for it. The end of the road for the Spadroon. So as I've said, the Spadroon had something like 200 years of service. The terms of shearing swords that Hope was talking about were really sort of common by the mid 17th century, and Spadroons as we know them were in British service phased out in 1821, but they went on around the world in other uses. This is, for example, a French sword. The French wouldn't have used the term Spadroon, but it's exactly the same kind of weapon. And they went on, and one of the most famous examples would be the American 1840 model, which was an NCO sword. And this is an original 1864 dated, so American Civil War era NCO sword. And you can see it very much is the same sort of form of the 1796 infantry Spadroon that I've been showing throughout the video. In fact, the styling is more French, but if you just forget the aesthetics, as a purely functional weapon, it is identical to a 1796 infantry officer's sword. They tend to be a little bit heavier, marginally, and the blade profile is a bit weird in that British swords tend to be a bit wider at the shoulder and have a bit more profile taper, whereas this has almost no profile taper as such at all, so it feels a little bit bar-like, which is a bit odd, but it is much the same weapon. And this went on in service, in fact it's still current issue, so as a dress sword it's still in use. So the Spadroon did go on for some time, just not really in British usage. Now, what really happened? Where did it go? Why did it go? And that's an interesting point. And a lot of people would cite the basically the poor abilities of it as an offensive and defensive weapon. Now, is that the reality of it or not? Now, swords change over time for their context. They sometimes change to be better at the same scenario, or they change because the scenario has changed. There are many reasons why swords evolve in different ways, and so many reasons for it happening. But the interesting point about the turnover from Spadroon usage to something else is you can see exactly why and how it's happening. So the reason the Spadroon was so popular is because it's agile and great with a point, and yet it can still cut. Now the sabres of the same period were quite curved, quite heavy, not so well suited to the thrust, so they're usually short as well, so they didn't have much reach, too much curvature for a lot of thrusting techniques the way that Europeans were using them, and not particularly good at the tip for actual thrust work either. So the difference between the Spadroon and sabre in the 18th century was substantial. Now, if you move into the 19th century and you start to look at what happened, you can see exactly what happened to the Spadroon. The Spadroon and the sabre merged into one, so one did not replace the other. If you look at the final patterns, because the Spadroon lived on alongside infantry sabres, specifically the 1803 pattern infantry officer's sword, which was approved for some infantry officers but not all, although a lot of them did carry them. And if you look at the comparison of the two, and then what replaced both of them, which is the 1822 pattern infantry officer's sword, it basically combines the length, the point, and the thrust agility of a Spadroon, and also they're only lightly curved, so they've got much straighter, much closer to a Spadroon, but it combines that with a bit more oomph on the cut, if you like, because not all Spadroons were particularly great on cutting. Again, it's a generalisation, but certainly for the 796, many of them were light, so they've basically merged the two. They've taken some cutting ability of the sabre, and they've taken the thrust ability, the agility, and the range of the Spadroon. They've merged the two together, and they've ended up with what we now know as the Gothic hilted infantry officers' swords. And if you look at the Wilkinson blade examples, which is the blade that came in 1845, the 1845 blade sort of looks like an improved Spadroon blade. And I say improved largely because they can be a bit stiffer, but again there are Spadroons that are that stiff, and they have a little bit more mass in the tip for that cutting impact. Again, not all examples are exactly the same. So what happened to the Spadroon? Well, it didn't just die, it merged, it evolved with the other sabres into a more unified weapon that sort of did the job of both, was agile and fast, could cut, could thrust, and if you look at the Gothic hilted sabres, they were often called the cut and thrust sword, and they were also often called the regulation spit in the same derogatory fashion as the Spadroon, so that's what happened to them. Now it's also worth mentioning at this point that these derogatory terms and this hatred of different weapons, now people always bring up the Spadroon is called the regulation spit and the perfect encumbrance and all that kind of stuff, but they forget that actually most swords have documented accounts of just a bitter hatred towards it. There are historical accounts of people being angry and disappointed in pretty much all of the examples that are being used. Even swords that today we would think of were fantastic, like the 1796 light cavalry sabre, which people absolutely love, and the heavy cavalry, which some people love and some people hate, and you will just find it across the board. And the same goes for the light infantry sabres, which again, some people love and some people hate. So it's common for a soldier to complain about his equipment, in part because it might not be good enough, and in part because he perceives that the enemy has better. There are many reasons, it still happens today, but it would be wrong to assume that the Spadroon was just the only focus of this bitter hatred. The Spadroon, in just a short time period, had some bad examples. And that brings us down to the conclusion of this video. Is the Spadroon a master of all weapons or the perfect encumbrance? And the simple answer is it's both. And you're talking hundreds of years of time with many different types, and even within a regulation there are massive varieties. So the Spadroon can be, in terms of what it's trying to be, and what it potentially can be is an excellent sword. But if you make it badly, if you execute it badly, you make bad decisions, you can end up with something really bad. So, is the Spadroon good or bad? It is both. You're going to have to judge them on individual examples. But without a doubt, it's really, really important to the history of British military swordsmanship because they were really commonly used for a couple of hundred years. There were plenty of really good examples of that, and there were plenty of really bad examples of that. And for me personally, I find that absolutely fascinating from a collector's perspective, from a historian's perspective, and from a martial arts perspective. Is there are good examples, there are bad examples, and they're just fascinating to explore the whole range. So anyway, I really do hope you enjoyed this short documentary, and I hope it's fired up a bit of love and a bit of passion for the Spadroon, because it is a weapon that is often badly misunderstood, and we're trying to really spread the word and get people involved and just, practice with it more as well, because we're looking at it not just from a history perspective, not just from a collector's perspective, those are interesting, but also from reading the source manuals, studying from them, using these swords today now for martial arts, for sport, for fun. So, there you go, there's the Spadroon, both a good and a bad sword. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed already, please do so.